welcome again to the Law, Policing and Justice podcast, episode 7, and I hope you're all keeping well. My name is Noreen Chowdhury and I'm the Supervising Solicitor leading the Legal Advice Centre at the University of East London. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing the topic on AI and access to justice. We have two special guests today. Hi Mark and Olubunmi.
Hi.
Firstly, we have Dr. Olubunmi Onofuwa, who is a Senior Lecturer and Researcher in Law. Dr. Olubunmi is also the current Programme Leader for the LLB Law and former Interim Head of Law, Policing and Justice at the University of East London. Her research expertise includes, but are not limited to, human rights, access to justice and the side effects arising from the repeated cuts of legal aid to recipients and service providers in the UK. Her venture into the academia started with her doctorate grounded in social legal studies, which examined the expansion of legal aid through the customary court system in Nigeria, during which her desire to advocate for a fairer society was nurtured. Since then, she has authorised a number of leadership articles for the Solicitor's Journal, The Conversation and other media outlets, as well as the peer-reviewed African Journal of International and Comparative Law. Her most recent peer-reviewed journal article, 10 Years and Beyond, a socio-legal study of the impact of legal aid cuts on service providers in England and Wales, submitted to the Legal Ethics Journal, has been received with a critical acclaim and signals her continued dedication to fight for equal treatment and access to justice via legal aid. Then we have Mark Zag, who is a Senior Lecturer and Researcher in Law and current Associate Course Leader for the Law with Criminology pathway at the University of East London. Originally from a practitioner's background, his expertise at this time centred around restorative justice and its utilisation to solve various issues native to the criminal justice system, particularly in relation to the matters of domestic violence and sexual assault. Mark's own research journey after joining the UL PhD programme shifted to focus primarily on law and technology. From cybercrime, digital ethics and debunking the myths surrounding the capabilities of artificial intelligence, Mark has actually written and continues to author a variety of leadership pieces on these subject matters for The Conversation and the Solicitor's Journal. His most recent peer-reviewed journal article, set for publication in the Crossing Conceptual Boundaries Journal, supposed to define autonomous weapon systems and examine the effectiveness of human oversight. Mark has actually subsequently also expanded his expertise even further by qualifying as a mediator for both interpersonal and civil commercial disputes, as well as through his work for the judiciary. So, Olubunmi and Mark, I will let our students introduce themselves and then they will put their questions forward to you. Thank you for coming in. Over to you all.
Yes, I'm Damra, I'm level 5 student. And my first question to you is going to be, what is AI, artificial intelligence? Is it ChatGPT?
Okay, that's a very good question. So I'll preface this by saying that lately, artificial intelligence as a term has been used so much and with utter disregard for the actual term that it's lost all meaning. So it can describe almost anything in the realm of machine learning. In this instance, ChatGPT, to address the second part of your question, is a type of AI. It's specifically based on a large language model. So when we talk about AI today, I suppose I will have to preface each individual aspect and qualify what types of AI we're talking about in relation to, I suppose, any other question that you have. So as a brief summary, there are various facets to AI. It involves many different aspects, including machine learning, deep learning, data set analysis. But ChatGPT is a type of artificial intelligence, and I'll get more to that later.
How can AI be used to facilitate access to justice?
Well, that's a really good question. I suppose we first need to address the concept of access to justice. And Bumi, I think you're absolutely the right person to lead on this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, there are lots of questions with regards to how AI can facilitate access to justice. However, there are issues with, accessing justice already, and then we're looking at AI coming in and I wouldn't say causing more issues, but kind of more concern. So first and foremost, I will talk about maybe legal aid, because that's kind of my area, and how it affects individuals that are seeking to go before the courts and are not they don't have the means to instruct a lawyer, for example. And I mean, obviously, we're looking at, I mean, you're law students and we are in this field. We understand the law to a certain degree, but then we're looking at the entire population, majority of people who we call lay people and have no idea how the system works. So going back to the cuts with regards to legal aid, and individuals are not able to instruct a lawyer, so they are kind of forced into a position where they have to represent themselves. So this is another problem. So again, if these individuals are not able to look at these instructions, from AI, like it is readily available as it is, and even though it's been signaled as being groundbreaking, and I mean, I do agree to a certain degree, though. There are individuals that would read the information out there, so the information will be out there. So if you ask AI or, whatever platform questions with regards to you have a case, what should I say, what should I do, or what's, whatever the questions. I mean, that's another issue. What questions do you ask to get the actual, what do I say if you're representing yourself, for example? So this is one of the issues that we're being faced with, and we're looking into it, because like I always say, I don't hate AI, because people feel, oh, maybe we don't want, no one can stop technology. We're kind of years behind technology anyway, so we have to embrace it, but we have to look at the problems first. Whatever the solution is has to be kind of follows off from what the issues are. Again, self-representation. Individuals might not know what to say. So we have individuals that are not even capable, so like mentally capable to use these tools. So yes, they're readily available. We have even educated people who are not able to look at these platforms and utilize them to their benefit. So I think my main issue really is individuals that are kind of affected by the cuts by legal aid and having to represent themselves. How do they face the judge? I mean, there's another argument about how the judge actually responds whilst they're using AI, but I'm not going to go into that now. We might get into it maybe as we go along, but that's one of my main issues, or the issues that I believe is something that we really need to look into. And then we go to your question: can AI actually, can it facilitate? Can it help access to justice? And I guess after listening to me, you would have maybe some questions. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. But I'll pass it over to my learned colleague, Mark, because he's an expert in AI. Trust he'll do justice to that.
Well, I'll certainly try, and thank you, Bumi, for preemptively borrowing my learned colleague line. Coming back to the previous question, what is AI? I suppose when we are discussing the facilitation of justice, we need to discuss what type of AI program it would be utilized and in what way. A lot of proponents of, I suppose, artificial intelligence as a whole, and we were discussing before how the term has lost its meaning, stipulate that it would eventually replace solicitors as a whole. Do I believe this? Do I think it is warranted? In the short term, I suppose the next 10 years, no. Not at all, especially if we're talking about generative artificial intelligence. So generative artificial intelligence would be the ChatGPT equivalent that we were discussing, and other similar technologies. Knowing how they work, at least on a basic level, the fact that they do not draw from a large data set, but rather use a predictive algorithm to identify the next letter in a sequence and just create something that is most likely to be the correct answer, but again, it's very sophisticated guesswork. I do not think that will actually facilitate the necessary access to justice, because going off of what my learned colleague, Dr. Onofua, suggested before, there are people who can't use the technology or don't know how to use the technology because they either don't have the expertise or the ability to understand the concepts that are being put forward. For better or worse, I think we all know that law is very complicated. And although there have been discussions about simplifying the terminology by itself does not eradicate the multiple processes that are put in place. So from a generative artificial intelligence prospect, I think we're a long way from actually it being useful to facilitate access to justice. If we want to talk about supportive AI programs, essentially better versions of what are currently in place to help solicitors improve their, I suppose, balance in terms of work and life. That could be very, very good. It might help people come into the profession. It might help them be more attuned, have more time to actually review cases rather than doing the grunt work, for the lack of a better phrase. So that I see being quite realistic, at least in the short term, especially in the long term. But again, there are a lot of issues regarding, I suppose, ethics, which I won't get into right now. Perhaps it will come up later on in the podcast. But hopefully that answers the question.
Just to add on, to add on to that, the human element, whoever's advising. So if that person at some point is entitled to legal aid and probably doesn't really need to or has the option of speaking to a professional in that area of law, they would, they rather, I'm supposing, they would rather speak to a human being as opposed to, going onto the computer and asking the computer to give them, because again, the human element, empathy and, all of that, which as individuals, as human beings, these are the things we need regardless of, technology or not. We do need to be reassured. Again, when you're faced with litigation, you want to look into the eyes of the person advising you, and especially if it's something that has to do with your liberty or your mental, well-being. You want to speak to someone. I'm not sure if AI is able, maybe, because, they say that AI can do anything, but the human element, I'm not too sure.
No, that's absolutely true, and I will make an addendum to your addition, which is the fantastic addition, and thank you so much for mentioning it. It is very much this human element that people, I think, especially the proponents of artificial intelligence as the savior of a lot of industries, are forgetting. I'll mention briefly, I suppose, the philosophical concept of Chesterton's fence, which, J.K. Chesterton offered I'm not exactly sure what word to use, but it was the theorem, for the lack of the actual descriptive term, that somebody should not get rid of a concept or a mode of operation before understanding why it was there in the first place. And I suppose the best example to illustrate this was there was the National Eating Disorder Association in the United States that got rid of their entire helpline and replaced it with an AI chatbot. Now, there are a lot of elements to this story. Why did they get rid of their workers? Why did they specifically use an AI chatbot, which, in all fairness, was painstakingly created by a set of researchers to specifically aid rather than replace the workers as a whole. However, subsequently, when it was implemented and they also installed a generative element, or at least the host company did, they got rid of all their workers, all their volunteers. Now, but if we go back to Chesterton's fence and we can stipulate that they had no idea, or they did not truly understand the impact a human being had, or perhaps they did and they didn't care. But ultimately, before we put any kind of technology in place that replaces the human element so much, we have to understand what the impact is, as Dr. Onofua was mentioning before.
Chatbots, they're the worst. You go online and they just, sometimes they cut you off. You have to go back many times, and I kind of do other things on there and they don't, no response that you need. And eventually you spend about 30 minutes going back and forth and then ask, do you want to be transferred to one of our
representatives?
Yes, like a supervisor. And I'm like, oh.
Wow.
Always the point.
Yes.
Exactly. So
chatbots, good for some things, but not for emergencies, like my colleague mentioned here. Like, if it's eating disorders, they want to speak to an individual. That's my fear, that we're saying, yes, AI is great, but we cannot substitute AI and just say that human beings are normal. And yours is actually a very great example of how the impact it would have on individuals, and then it leads on to other things.
Yeah.
This is a thing. So if someone has an eating disorder and they need to be someone has a case and they're really, they're stressed out, and it makes things worse if they're not able to see someone or speak to someone that could actually give them the information that they need. It might just be 5 minutes of talk can actually save someone's life. I don't know what AI would do in that situation. I know it, so I'm not totally oblivious of, how AI works and how, but AI is us, I believe, and, whatever we tell it to do, it does. how are we going to preempt what? It's just like law. Like, law doesn't cover everything. And this is why we go on and on about, how the law works and how it doesn't in some situations, and what do we do to, cover these issues. Yeah, that's my take.
Thank you.
So, my name is Ayomide, and my question for you, I feel like I already know your answer, but like my question for you is, will using AI actually help, or do you think it wouldn't?
That's actually a good question.
I can just say very briefly, I'm not going to go deep into it. I think AI would help in some aspects of, so we're not totally saying, oh, AI, we don't want it, whatever. Like I said, it's here to stay. It's just how we utilize it. It can help, but to a certain degree, we don't put it in a situation whereby, because there was this thing going on, like AI is going to take over, solicitors. I mean, within the legal system, that's scary. And judges are relying on it for sentencing. That's worrying.
What that extent will be, we'll just have to wait and see how it'll pan out in the future. It comes back to a fundamental misunderstanding of what artificial intelligence is for, I suppose, the layman who is not really interested in dabbling in the intricacies of it. The other issue is people who push for AI integration all the time. I don't know, no, I do know, but in some instances they have no vested interest, and they want to, I suppose, have a podium and speak about something that they are knowledgeable about. However, they suggest it is better than what it actually is. So they're trying to say that you need to implement it now, you have to accept this change. It is the future, and the sooner we accept it, the better it is. I suppose it is somewhat of a platitude what they put forward, and that's fine. Platitudes do have some basis upon which they can be used. However, you need to explain why. How is it going to help? And typically the explanation that I have received, especially in relation to access to justice, is always viewed from a particular perspective. They don't take into consideration the socially disadvantaged. They don't take into consideration the digitally divide, or, I suppose, the crumbling education system, but that is a discussion for another time. Students or young adults need to be aware how to use this technology. They need to be aware of how to experiment in an ethical and a considerate manner. And realistically, it is going to help, but how useful it is going to be and for how many people are going to find it useful eventually, it's all going to hinge on, I suppose, early integration and getting people to understand its its positive and negative characteristics. There seems to be an overemphasis on positive ones, and negative ones tend to be not necessarily swept under the rug, but they're rebranded. So if we see generative AI like ChatGPT, it got something wrong. What do we call that? A hallucination. Okay, well, it's a fancy term, and I'm guilty of using it myself. But no, it's not a hallucination. You can call it that, but it's generated misinformation. And it becomes even worse when people rely on that generated misinformation to do their job. We had the case where the solicitor, a lawyer in the United States, I think his last name was Schwartz. Could be wrong. I will have to double check the name. But essentially, he asked ChatGPT for case references. It gave him 6. He asked, are these accurate? Are these real? The system went yes, and then he presented it at a court. The judges were very confused. They said these are not real, and he was subsequently reprimanded. And I think this was a solicitor who had decades worth of experience within the profession. So it's very unfortunate that there can't be a level of honesty and transparency about artificial intelligence. And that brings us into the argument of data sets and bias, etc. But I suppose we can explore that a little bit later if we have time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, to my next question. Would you rather AI be used like an assistant rather than it's taking the front row?
That's actually
No,
that's a good question.
that's a
Like,
good
well-formed,
The
formatted question. Yeah. I mean, what do you think?
Right now, assisted. The technology is simply not there for it to take center stage. And all the examples of where they've tried to make it take center stage have gone wrong. Especially if you see, there was the case with an airline, which I won't mention the name for very specific reasons, but they had it sort of advertise rates. and it got something wrong, and they were subsequently held to that rate. Now, in their infinite wisdom, they decide to take the matter to court and stipulate, no, we are not being held accountable for what the generated chatbot would say. And the judge disagreed and said, no, you are. So we have to thank this particular airline, who shall remain nameless.
But you wouldn't want a situation where an individual is maybe faced with litigation or in the courts, and then the solicitor's firm then blame,
Yes.
and then blame AI for someone that was probably, the repercussions were just too great, and then, we don't want issues like that. We don't want people thinking, and again, we already have issues with individuals within England and Wales not really trusting the judicial system, and then this, and it's kind of, again, as we spoke about, it's not only about the solicitors or the lawyers giving legal advice, but we're also looking at the judges, and then we're also looking, mentioned bias in passing and confidentiality as well, because you have to put all this information into the system. If I have I want it to be confidential. How are you putting all my information, or what, because they're looking to generate something. So how do we go about that? So I think assisting, back to your question, for now, write some letters, something very simple and not too, that, the repercussions are not that great, as opposed to actually asking AI to advise a client or give you some pointers on, something that you probably as a solicitor would already know, or you could just spend a couple of hours researching yourself. So, that's my take on that. Assistance for now, and we'll see as it goes.
To the next question. What are the problems with using artificial intelligence to fill the gap left by the courts of legal?
Well, I suppose we should start off with you. What are the gaps in the criminal justice system left by slashing of legal aid over the... Is it 2 decades now they've been slashing it?
Oh yes, continuous slashing. Massive issue, yes, and is not getting any better. I don't know what the current government are, what their plans are with regards to legal aid, but as it stands, massive gaps, because there are a lot of individuals, vulnerable individuals, that are not able to access legal aid because of the cuts. I mean, recently just wrote an article, and we were talking about the impact on service providers, actually, and I normally talk about the vulnerable, so the people that are recipients of legal aid, and then there's another issue with the professionals that provide legal aid. We're losing a lot of them because the remuneration is not enough. They can't make a living. There are other areas of law where they could make money, but these are public defenders. I mean, if all of them went into commercial law or whatever and they make a lot of money, who's going to be defending the the normal, ordinary people? So the gaps are plenty, and the only way they can resolve it is, for the service providers, is through the remuneration, make it more attractive. Just like you do the judges. We do our judges in England and Wales, whereby they pay them a very good salary to avoid temptations of corruption. Something like that. For the recipients as well, to expand it, they're slowly cutting like housing issues. You look at the people that actually would have housing issues, immigration, some part of family. So they're chipping away bit by bit. So the gaps are plenty and not getting smaller.
I suppose if I were to feed into the question as well, it would link back to, I suppose, the previous question you had. Is it good as an assistant or to lead? In this instance, if we were to say as an assistant, it could absolutely help plug in some gaps, especially with the massive backlog that exists. It could shorten wait time to allow the entire process to be more efficient. Could it actually lead and become an advisor in place of legal aid? Right now, no. Even in the future, and I'm talking about at least a decade down the line, the question is, even if you implement it, is it going to be good enough? Because right now, with the slashing of legal aid, you have the argument that we have a two-tier justice system. People who can afford solicitors are served justice, or they're able to gain access to justice. And people who do not have solicitors will struggle, and if they are able to get by, it's going to be entirely on their own merit. You could stipulate that, artificial intelligence, the generative kind, could help plug that gap. However, the question then becomes, Have we solved the two-tier justice system? Probably not. Because again, it's going to be the human orator versus somebody representing themselves just having access to, I suppose, legal arguments. That might soften the problem, but it won't solve it. So it could, in some instances, even make it worse. So the solution, well, if it's even going to be one, might not be as effective as people think. Of course, the future will prove what will happen, how technology advances, how well it operates, could make this entire argument moot completely. But if we factor in human warmth, the support people need to actually be listened to, having another body in the room, well then subsequently AI makes, or not subsequently, consequently, AI makes less and less sense. So we'll just have to wait and see. I know it's not the greatest answer in the world, but right now, it could help in an assistive way, but not as a replacement. In fact, it could make things much, much worse if you tend to brute force it into the system now.
Yeah, which is my concern actually, because I know there's a lot of talk on backlogs, and if AI comes in and makes all these decisions, and dangerous waters, just like Mark said, it's potentially make things worse in the long run, because nothing has really changed. So we're putting resources into AI, we're not putting it into actual human beings, and we're having all these potential great solicitors, public defenders, thinking I don't want to go into public defense because I'm not going to be able to make a living. So there's a massive issue, and it goes both ways, recipients and providers of legal aid.
What a great feedback. Amazing. According to your feedback, the question that I want to ask is, should we never consider AI? If yes, what are the alternatives?
No, you have to accept it as it is. It is coming for you. It is going to replace all these systems. You have to accept, you have to reskill, you have to move on. That's one camp. The other one is no, abolish it, get rid of it. And I don't think you can realistically take either one. I think there might be a fear that in this podcast we are coming across as slightly tech-phobic. We're not tech-phobic.
No.
We actually don't mind AI coming in
absolutely
as
not.
long as it's done ethically and properly.
Yeah.
And the lack of regulation and the over-reliance on guardrails, which is essentially the self-policing of the industry itself, is frankly, in my very humble opinion, ludicrous that it's gone on for so long. So we do have to consider it. But in terms of the alternatives, I mean, you will know what the alternatives are.
I mean, the alternatives is more resources, put more funding into the to the legal system, right? Rebuilds. We've had 2 past law society presidents, really fighting for that. And at this point, again, I don't know what the plans are with our new government, but hopefully, things improve. They actually see it for what it is, because we are in a society, the majority cannot afford, when it comes down to it, the majority cannot afford to instruct a lawyer. They can't afford a lawyer. They will need legal aid. They will need someone to actually tell them, okay, fine, this is what's going to happen, or potentially what's going to happen, and this is how we move forward. An individual, like my colleague said, another body in the room, telling, because we're human beings at the end of the day, and this is what we require. Again, going back to mention the stuff I mentioned in my recent article was about when they make all these cuts, they don't consider other stuff. So from the interviews that I did, you can see that the barrister solicitors that I interviewed, they were talking about, okay, fine, yes, we kind of understand that maybe some adjustments need to be made, but then they have to consider the impact on the NHS, for example. So we're saying, the NHS is crumbling, but you're sending all these individuals that are not, have family issues, and they can't afford a lawyer. They're representing themselves. They don't know what to say in front of the judge. It all fell through, and now they're, in hospital because they have, the impact on their mental well-being was just too great. So you have all these, trickle down impacts on individuals. So we're not helping. And then people, for example, in employment, people lose their jobs. They're not able to maybe fight their case, and then they go on benefits, that sort of thing. So that was just the argument. And I think it makes sense, to be honest.
I have just one question for both of you, my last question. Do you think law would be more receptive to AI if there was one created specifically for law?
Okay, well, there has to be one, and we said, I think earlier on in the podcast, we would come back to the notion of confidentiality and privacy.
Yes.
So this would essentially be it. Anyone who is, I suppose, using ChatGPT and inputting actual client data into it, and I'm sure there are several people who are doing it, are
Sure.
breaching GDPR. They are violating it to an extreme. To this effect, because we know confidentiality is key, we have to know where the data goes. There has to be one specifically designed for that. How that will be created and how it will operate, unfortunately, my knowledge of the technology is not that involved. However, I am learning as the process goes along. So hopefully, in the future, I'll have an answer. But I just know that you cannot use a generic model. It has to be specifically designed for a task. And this is not just exclusive to law. It'll extend to medicine. Anything that involves private information has to be specifically designed for that.
Thank you both for answering all the questions. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you Olubunmi and Mark for coming in, and thank you to our visitors for putting their questions forward. And to our listeners, thank you for listening in, and we will be back, and please do stay connected. Now, if you do wish to get involved with our Law, Policing and Justice podcast, please email the Legal Advice Centre at uel.ac.uk. And if you wish to explore more on the law, policing and justice courses, please visit www.uel.ac.uk. As always, thank you so much for listening, and stay well.